The evening had settled into a quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if the world outside had agreed to leave the house untouched. A soft amber glow from the lamp in the corner stretched across the room, wrapping everything in warmth, muted, calm, and a little too intimate for an ordinary night. I sat on the edge of the sofa, a book resting open in my hands, though I hadn't turned a page in several minutes. Across from me, she moved quietly, the faint sound of her footsteps barely noticeable against the silence. There was something different about her that evening, not obvious, not dramatic, just softer somehow. Like she was carrying a thought she hadn't decided whether to share. When she finally sat beside me, it wasn't her usual composed distance. She chose the space closer than expected, not touching, but near enough that I could feel the subtle warmth of her presence. A faint scent of something floral, jasmine, maybe, drifted gently between us, familiar now, but somehow more noticeable in the quiet. For a moment neither of us spoke. She exhaled slowly, her fingers loosely intertwined in her lap, then separating, then coming back together again, a small, nervous habit I hadn't seen before. I glanced at her, just briefly, but she was already looking at me. Not casually. Intentionally. Her eyes held something I couldn't immediately name. Not sadness exactly, but something deeper. Something that had been waiting. "I was thinking about something," she said softly. Her voice wasn't fragile, but it wasn't as steady as usual either. It carried a weight that made me straighten slightly without realizing it. I closed the book without marking the page. "What is it?" I asked gently. She hesitated, not dramatically, just enough to show that the next words mattered. Then, almost as if she was afraid the moment might pass if she waited too long, she leaned just a little closer, not enough to invade space, but enough to lower her voice. "I think..." She paused, her gaze dropping for a second before returning to mine. "I want a child someday." The words landed quietly, but they didn't feel small. Something about the way she said it, so honest, so unguarded, made it impossible to treat it like a passing thought. It wasn't casual. It wasn't hypothetical. It was real. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't want to, but because I could feel that she hadn't just shared a wish. She had revealed a part of herself she'd been holding in for a long time. Her hand shifted slightly on the cushion between us, closer to mine now. Not touching. Just there. Close enough that I could sense the warmth, the almost contact. "I know it sounds sudden," she added, her voice quieter now, almost searching for reassurance. "I don't usually say things like that out loud." I shook my head gently. "It doesn't sound sudden," I said. "It sounds important." Her expression changed, not into a smile, not fully, but something softened. As if being understood, even a little, had eased something inside her. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Full. Her eyes lingered on mine just a moment longer than before, and for the first time, I felt something shift in the space between us. Not something loud or overwhelming, but something undeniable. Something that wasn't there yesterday. And as I sat there, aware of her presence in a way I hadn't been before, one thought settled quietly in my mind. This wasn't just a conversation. This was the beginning of something neither of us had planned for, but somehow, both of us had been waiting to feel. The next morning didn't feel the same. Nothing obvious had changed. The house was just as quiet, the light just as soft as it filtered through the curtains, but there was a subtle shift in the air. Something unspoken lingered between us, like the echo of a conversation that hadn't fully ended. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the counter with a cup of tea in her hands. She wasn't doing anything in particular, just holding it, staring faintly into the rising steam as if her thoughts were somewhere far beyond the room. "Good morning," I said gently. She looked up, almost startled for a second, before offering a small, polite smile. "Morning." Her voice was composed again. Calm. Measured. The version of her I had grown used to. But now I could see the difference. There was a slight hesitation in her eyes, like she was holding something back, or maybe pulling something back in. I leaned against the counter across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "Did you sleep okay?" A simple question. An easy one. She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just a little tired, that's all." But she didn't meet my eyes when she said it. And for some reason, I didn't let it go this time. "About last night," I said, my voice softer now, careful not to push too hard. "You don't have to feel weird about it." Her fingers tightened slightly around the cup. Just enough to notice. For a moment, I thought she might brush it off, give a light laugh, change the subject, retreat back into safety. But she didn't. Instead, she exhaled slowly and set the cup down, as if freeing her hands made it easier to speak. "I don't usually talk about things like that," she admitted, her gaze lowering to the counter. "Not because I don't think about them, but because—" She paused, searching for the right words. "It feels like something I missed." The honesty in her voice caught me off guard again, but this time, it felt heavier. More grounded. I didn't interrupt. "I always thought life would just happen the way it does for everyone else," she continued, a faint, almost distant smile touching her lips. "You know, family, timing, everything falling into place." She shook her head lightly. "But sometimes it doesn't." There was no bitterness in her tone. No anger. Just acceptance. And that somehow made it harder to hear. I stepped a little closer, not too much, just enough to feel present. "That doesn't mean it's gone," I said quietly. "It just means it hasn't happened yet." She looked up at me then. Really looked. There was something fragile in her expression now, not weakness, but openness. The kind that only shows when someone stops pretending they're completely fine. "Maybe," she said softly. "Or maybe some things are just meant to stay as wishes." The way she said it made my chest tighten slightly. Not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then, almost absent-mindedly, her hand moved, resting lightly on the counter between us. Without thinking, I shifted mine closer. Not touching. Just near enough to close the distance. She noticed. Her fingers hesitated, then gently brushed against mine. It wasn't a full gesture. Not intentional enough to call it a move. But not accidental either. Neither of us pulled away. "I didn't expect you to understand," she said quietly, her voice softer than before. I glanced at her, a small, sincere smile forming. "I don't think you needed me to," I replied. "I think you just needed someone to listen." Her expression changed again, this time warmer, lighter. Like something inside her had eased, even if just a little. And in that moment, standing there in the quiet morning light, I realized something had shifted again. Not just in what she had shared, but in how close we had quietly become without even realizing it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of us acknowledged, but both of us quietly felt. It wasn't anything dramatic. No sudden changes, no defining moment you could point to and say that's where everything shifted. Instead, it was something softer, a gradual easing into each other's presence, like two lives adjusting their pace without needing to say why. Mornings began to overlap more often. At first, it was coincidence, meeting in the kitchen at the same time, exchanging polite greetings, moving around each other with careful awareness. But soon, it turned into something more intentional. I started waking up a little earlier. She lingered a little longer. Tea became a shared habit. She would pour 2 cups without asking. I would take the seat across from her without hesitation. The conversations were simple, nothing too personal at first. Small observations, light remarks, but even in those ordinary exchanges, there was a growing ease. She laughed more now. Not loudly, not often, but enough that I noticed. A soft, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even her sometimes, like she hadn't expected herself to feel that light. And I found myself watching her in those moments, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that felt appreciative. There was something quietly captivating about her. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. The way her voice softened at the end of certain sentences. The way her eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary before looking away. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered gently through the window, we sat side by side at the table, closer than we usually did. She reached across to adjust something on my sleeve, a small fold in the fabric I hadn't even noticed. "Hold on," she murmured softly. Her fingers brushed against my arm, slow and careful, smoothing the crease with quiet precision. It was such a simple gesture, barely anything at all. But she didn't pull away immediately. Her touch lingered. Just for a second longer than needed. And in that second, something unspoken passed between us. I didn't move. Neither did she. Then, as if realizing the moment had stretched a little too far, she withdrew her hand gently, her gaze shifting away with a faint, almost shy smile. "Sorry," she said lightly. "It was bothering me." I glanced down at my sleeve, then back at her. "I didn't mind." The words came out naturally, but they carried more meaning than I had intended. She didn't respond right away. But I saw it, the subtle change in her expression, the way her eyes softened just slightly, like she had heard something beneath the surface. From that point on, the space between us felt different. Closer. More aware. Even our silences had changed. They weren't just pauses between words anymore, they felt like shared moments, comfortable and full in a way that didn't need filling. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet closeness, I noticed something shifting inside me too. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't overwhelming. But it was there. Clear enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Being around her didn't just feel easy. It felt important. And as I sat there beside her, the soft light catching in her hair, her presence steady and warm just inches away, one thought settled gently in my mind. This wasn't just familiarity growing between us. It was something deeper. Something neither of us had named yet. But both of us were beginning to feel that it didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where everything felt different, no sudden realization that forced me to stop and question what was happening between us. Instead, it came quietly, like a thought that kept returning, growing clearer each time until it could no longer be ignored. Something had changed. Not just in the way we spoke, or the way we sat a little closer than before, but in the way I noticed her now. And more importantly, in the way I was starting to think about what that meant. That awareness brought a kind of hesitation with it. A line I hadn't considered before suddenly felt very real. She felt it too. I could see it in the way she moved around me now, still warm, still kind, but just slightly more careful. Like she was measuring the space between us again, trying to return things to something safer, something more defined. Conversations became a little shorter. Not distant, not cold, just restrained. Where she used to linger in the kitchen while I finished my tea, now she would excuse herself a little earlier. Where our silences once felt shared, now they carried a faint tension, like both of us were aware of what wasn't being said. One afternoon, I caught it clearly. She was standing in the doorway, watching me. I hadn't noticed her at first, only felt something, a quiet presence, before looking up. And there she was still, her hand resting lightly against the frame. For a second, either of us moved. Her gaze didn't shift right away this time. It held mine, steady, thoughtful, almost searching. Then, as if she suddenly realized what she was doing, she straightened slightly, her expression softening back into something more neutral. "I didn't mean to interrupt," she said calmly. "You weren't," I replied. But the moment had already passed. Still, it stayed with me. That look. Later that evening, We found ourselves in the kitchen again, drawn into the same space out of habit more than intention. The air felt different this time, quieter, but not as easy. Careful. She reached for a cup at the same time I did. Our hands met. Not brushed. Met. And for the briefest moment, either of us pulled away. Her fingers rested lightly against mine, warm, still, aware. I felt it instantly, the weight of something unspoken pressing into that small point of contact. Then, almost at the same time, we both stepped back. "Sorry," she said softly. "It's okay," I replied, though my voice came out quieter than I expected. We didn't reach for the cup again right away. Instead, we stood there for a second longer than necessary, both of us looking anywhere but at each other. That's when it settled fully in my mind. This wasn't simple anymore. It wasn't just shared space or quiet companionship. There was something here, something real enough to be felt, but complicated enough to make us hesitate. I leaned back slightly against the counter, exhaling under my breath. Was I imagining it, or was she feeling this too? The question lingered, heavier than before. Because now, it didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like truth waiting to be acknowledged. And as I glanced at her again, her movements just a little too deliberate, her composure just a little too controlled, I realized something else. She knew it too. Neither of us had said a word. But the line between us, the one that hadn't existed before, was now clearly there. And for the first time, we were both aware of how close we were to crossing it. That evening, the rain came without warning. It started as a soft patter against the windows, barely noticeable at first, until it grew steadier, filling the quiet house with a gentle, constant rhythm. The sky darkened earlier than usual, and the soft glow of the lamps became the only warmth against the gray outside. There was something about rainy nights that made everything feel more honest. Maybe it was the way the world slowed down. Maybe it was the way silence became heavier, harder to ignore. Or maybe it was just that neither of us could pretend we didn't feel it anymore. I found her in the living room, sitting near the window, watching the rain trace slow paths down the glass. She didn't turn when I entered, but I knew she was aware of me. She always was. "Storm came out of nowhere," I said quietly, stepping closer. "It usually does," she replied, her voice soft, distant, not cold, just thoughtful. I hesitated for a moment before sitting down, not across from her this time, but beside her. Close enough that our shoulders were only inches apart. She didn't move away. For a while, we just sat there, listening to the rain. No small talk. No distractions. Just the quiet presence of each other, and everything we had been avoiding. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," she said suddenly. Her voice broke the silence gently, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. I turned slightly toward her. "You didn't." She let out a faint breath, almost like a quiet laugh, but there was no real humor in it. "It feels like I did," she admitted. "Saying things I should have kept to myself, letting you see parts of me that aren't." She paused, searching for the right word. "Simple." I shook my head lightly. "None of it felt wrong," I said. "Just real." That word lingered between us. Real. She finally turned to look at me, her expression softer now, less guarded than it had been in days. "You make it sound easy," she said quietly. "It's not easy," I replied. "But it doesn't have to be something we avoid either." For a moment, she just looked at me, really looked. And then something in her shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. Her hand moved slowly, resting on the space between us. This time, there was no hesitation in the motion, only a quiet decision. I felt it before it happened. The gentle warmth of her fingers as they settled over mine. Not accidental. Not uncertain. Intentional. I didn't pull away. Neither did she. The contact was soft, steady, her hand light against mine, but grounding in a way that felt deeper than the gesture itself. I didn't expect you to understand, she said, her voice barely above a whisper now. I glanced down at our hands for a second, then back at her. I don't think you needed me to understand everything, I said gently. Just not to turn away. Her fingers tightened slightly, not gripping, just holding a little more firmly. And in that moment, the distance we had been trying to maintain quietly disappeared. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping insistently against the windows, but inside, everything felt still. Closer. Warmer. I was afraid, she admitted softly. Not of saying it, but of what it might change. I nodded slowly. Maybe it was always going to change something. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back slightly into the sofa, her shoulder brushing against mine this time, not by accident, not by chance. And she stayed there. No pulling away. No second-guessing. Just quiet acceptance of the closeness between us. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. I didn't expect you to stay in this moment with me, she whispered. I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. I wasn't planning on leaving. Her expression softened completely then, something unspoken finally settling into place. And as we sat there, hand in hand, the rain surrounding us, the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt full. Like something fragile had finally been allowed to exist. Out in the open, without fear. And for the first time, either of us tried to step back from it. The morning after felt quieter than usual, but not in the same way as before. It wasn't the kind of silence that came from distance or hesitation. This time, it felt settled. Like something had already been said, even if the words hadn't fully formed yet. I found her in the kitchen again, standing by the window, the early light catching softly against her face. She looked calm, more at ease than I had seen her in days, but there was still a trace of something thoughtful in her expression. She turned when she heard me, offering a small smile. Morning. Morning, I replied, stepping inside. For a moment, everything felt almost normal. Familiar. But beneath that, there was a quiet awareness, something we both carried now. Last night hadn't disappeared. It was still here, just waiting to be understood. I leaned lightly against the counter, watching her as she poured tea into 2 cups, like she always did. But this time, her movements were slower, more deliberate. As if she was thinking through something with every step. We should probably talk, she said gently, without looking at me. I nodded. Yeah. I was thinking the same. She handed me the cup, her fingers brushing mine briefly, soft, natural. Neither of us reacted to it the way we might have before. That small contact didn't feel like a question anymore. It felt like acknowledgement. We sat down across from each other, the space between us not as distant as it once was, but still careful. Measured. She took a breath, her gaze lowering for a second before returning to mine. I don't want to pretend last night didn't happen, she said. But I also don't want to rush into something we haven't really thought through. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the honesty in it. Not fear. Not avoidance. Just maturity. I'm not trying to rush anything, I said quietly. I just didn't want to act like it didn't mean something. She held my gaze, her eyes softening slightly. It did, she admitted. That simple answer carried more weight than anything else she could have said. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the table. Being around you feels different, I said honestly. Not confusing, just real. And I don't think I want to ignore that. She listened carefully, her expression thoughtful, not pulling away, not shutting down. Just taking it in. It feels real to me too, she said after a pause. That's what makes it complicated. I understood what she meant without needing her to explain. This wasn't something casual. It wasn't something light. And because of that, it mattered more. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached forward, her hand coming to rest lightly over mine again. This time, the gesture felt calmer, more grounded. Not a moment of vulnerability, but a quiet choice. I just don't want us to lose ourselves in something we haven't fully faced yet, she said softly. I turned my hand slightly beneath hers, letting the contact settle naturally. Then we don't rush it, I replied. We just stay honest. Her fingers shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against mine. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let out a small breath, her shoulders easing just a little, as if something inside her had finally found balance. I can do that, she said quietly. We sat there for a while after that, no pressure to fill the silence, no urgency to define everything. Her shoulder brushed lightly against mine when she moved to sit beside me instead of across. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't accidental either. And this time, the closeness didn't feel uncertain. It felt steady. Not everything had been decided. Not every question had been answered. But something important had been agreed on. We weren't going to ignore what we felt. And we weren't going to rush into something we didn't understand. We were simply going to stay here. Honest, aware, and quietly choosing to move forward, together, one moment at a time. The days that followed didn't rush forward. They unfolded slowly, quiet mornings, unspoken understandings, and a growing sense that something between us had settled into place. Not fully defined, not labeled, but real enough that neither of us questioned it anymore. There was a calmness now. Not the kind that comes from certainty, but the kind that comes from acceptance. We didn't avoid each other. We didn't overanalyze every moment either. Instead, we let things be what they were, simple, honest, and present. One evening, just before sunset, we found ourselves outside. The air was warm, carrying a soft breeze that moved gently through the trees. The sky was painted in fading gold and pale orange, the kind of light that made everything feel quieter than usual. She sat beside me on the low step near the garden, her hands resting loosely in her lap. For a while, we didn't say anything, just watched the horizon shift as the days slowly gave way to night. It felt right. Being there like this. Together, without needing to explain it. I've been thinking, she said finally, her voice calm, thoughtful. I turned slightly toward her. About what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced down at her hands, then back up at the sky. About us, she said softly. There was no tension in her tone this time. No hesitation. Just honesty. I nodded slowly, waiting. I don't have everything figured out, she continued. I don't know what this becomes, or how it fits into the rest of life. She paused, then let out a small, almost amused breath. And maybe that used to scare me more than it should have. I watched her carefully, noticing how different she felt now, not guarded, not uncertain, just open. But now? I asked gently. She turned her head slightly, meeting my eyes. Now I think it's okay not to have all the answers, she said. Something about the way she said it, so steady, so sure, made everything feel lighter. I nodded, a small smile forming. I was hoping you'd say that. She smiled too, not faintly, not cautiously, but fully. And it suited her. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the quiet between us no longer carrying any weight. It felt easy. Natural. Her hand shifted slightly, brushing against mine where it rested beside me. This time, either of us hesitated. Our fingers intertwined slowly, naturally, like it had always been meant to happen that way. Her touch was warm, steady. Certain. She leaned slightly closer, her shoulder resting gently against mine, her head tilting just enough to settle there comfortably. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overwhelming. But it felt complete. "I don't want to lose this," she said softly. I turned my head just enough to glance at her. "You won't," I replied. "Not if we keep it real." She nodded against my shoulder, her fingers tightening slightly around mine, not out of fear, but reassurance. We didn't make promises we couldn't keep. We didn't try to define something that was still growing. Instead, we chose something simpler. Something honest. To stay. To see where it goes. Together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the last light fading into a quiet dusk, I realized something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. We didn't need certainty to make this meaningful. We didn't need guarantees to make it real. All we needed was this. Her beside me. Her hand in mine. And the quiet understanding that whatever this was becoming, we were no longer facing it alone.